it's officially 4:20, so thanks for those of you who are here for one of the last sessions of the day, but hopefully you get to enjoy the booth crawl after this. So my name is Jen Madriaga. So my topic and title, it seems a little clickbaity, right? DEI is dead, what's next? So before I go into my presentation, I do want to introduce myself. So I've been working in open source for over 10 years. And before I had a career in tech, I actually worked in higher ed, in nonprofits, and arts organizations. So I have kind of this very all-encompassing background. I'm someone who's lived numerous places, including abroad, as well as around the country. And I did graduate work around issues of systemic inequality and disparity a very long time ago. And this was part of the reason why I wanted to give this talk, because I did want to give some context about what's going on, and then also just to talk about how the discussion around these issues has been evolving and iterating for decades. I was a co-founder of the Red Hat Asian Network, which was founded actually only about 5 years ago. And I'm interested in intersectionality. So everyone has layers of identity, and so I'm always interested in how things intersect. For me, I've got my own layered identity, being neurodivergent, as well as a woman and a child of immigrants. So, okay, so I guess those of you who've been watching the news have seen a smattering of headlines, especially if you are engaged in this space and it's something you've been working on for a long time. It can be downright demoralizing to read through these headlines, right? To see entire offices eliminated, programs defunded, the rhetoric now decidedly, okay, we're not even gonna touch it, we're gonna be basically erasing any trace of it publicly, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it feels like a very, very dark time, because basically we're banning this term, we're banning all the programs associated with it. And so I've had a lot of conversations with people about, well, what's gonna happen, what's next, right? So I know that things look dire, but I do think that there is an opportunity. When things break down, you have to build them back up. And when you build them back up, hopefully you build them back up better. So as I said, I've been in this space for a really long time, for several decades. And in fact, I look much older than I actually look. I am much older than I actually look. But I've been talking to people a very, very long time about this topic. And it doesn't matter who I talk to, there are all these themes that come to play. Whether you're part of an underrepresented group or you're part of the majority, you're part of the normative population, the same things come up over and over again when I have a conversation. And one thing that comes up all the time is the need for belonging. What's my place in the world? Can others understand my experience? Like everyone universally has that. The other thing that comes up every time is the need to be seen and validated. Everyone wants to feel that their contributions matter, and not only that their contributions matter, but they are recognized appropriately for the things that they contribute. And then also part of being seen and validated is, can I bring my whole self into situations without fear or self-consciousness? Can I actually show up as I am without fear or retribution? And the third thing that comes up time and time again, and of course this is interesting because every single person says fairness matters. Of course, there's subject to debate what fairness actually means, but every person I talk to says fairness matters. And what does this mean in terms of people defining fairness? Well, universally, I want access to resources and support, and I want access to opportunities. And so seeing this as a theme across everybody that I've talked to is meaningful to me, because part of it is when you have a conversation around something like DEI, you have to have a conversation. And that's the part that I'm very, very focused on, is how do we have conversations? So I don't know if anyone knows the work of Lily Zhang. Has anyone heard of Lily Zhang? If you've not heard of Lily Zhang, look them up. They are amazing. They are someone who I've been reading a lot of their work, and I will go into Lily's work a little bit later. But this comes from an article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review. And Lily says we gotta rethink DEI. And so part of the reason why we wanna rethink DEI is that 91% of workers report experiencing workplace discrimination. This is not underrepresented groups, this is everybody. So if you've got like 91% of your group feeling like they're being discriminated, you have to pay attention to that experience. And again, 94% care about a sense of belonging, which is, like I said, I found that anecdotally in the work that I've been doing. And then also what's concerning is that support for DEI has dropped to 50%. I think it was as high as like 3/4 to 80%, and now it's dropped to like a little bit above half. And then the main complaints about DEI are it's performative. Like, okay, let's go put out a social media post about how much we love DEI, without any kind of meaningful process or change happening. Or it's siloed, like only one group of person is responsible for it. No one else has responsibility except for this designated group of people. And then also, the impact hasn't been measured. And so I think these are all very valid things to think about when we think about what the movement is going to be after DEI. So I said that I was in this space a really long time, so over 30 years. And back when I started my work in this in graduate school, and even before then when I was a student activist as an undergraduate, we didn't have diversity, equity, inclusion as a term. We did not have DEI as a term. When I started, the term was interculturalism, because it was about, hey, we want people to kind of get together and integrate. And people said, no, that sounds assimilationist. So then it became multiculturalism, so that we can recognize that there's a multiplicity of people who are involved. And it's the mosaic, like they don't have to be like everyone else. And we want to recognize there's a bunch of different people involved, right? And then multiculturalism evolved into diversity. And then diversity said, no, we need to modify diversity. It needs to have equity. And then it needs to have inclusion. And then in some cases, people are like, we need accessibility. And we need justice tacked onto it. All right. Part of the reason why I want to highlight that historical perspective is we've been talking about this stuff a long time in different ways, with different jargon, but the issues are still the same. And so part of what I want to just kind of highlight around DEI, even though it's now out of fashion to use that terminology, is that the conversation is still going to continue. And how do we continue that conversation in a way that serves the well-being of everyone? So, and Lily Zhang has some really good things to say about it. Lily is an amazing person. They've been recognized for a lot of the work that they've done. They've written several books. If you want to start short, I would recommend the What Comes After DEI article. I wasn't able to upload my slides, but if you want them, I can email you a copy, and you can click on all the links that I feature in this presentation. So I want to talk a bit of the challenges around DEI. Like I said, I've been working in this space for a long time. One is a practitioner who trained other people, who managed student populations as an administrator. And so I've seen a lot of things, but the most recent things around DEI were related to when I was working at Red Hat. So I worked at Red Hat for almost 10 years. And like I said, I was a founder of the Red Hat Asia Network. And everything around like employee resource groups, or we called them DEI communities, they were international in scope, all right? And then I was also involved with a number of open source communities, including Fedora. And I don't know if anyone went to the last talk, but they now have contributors on every continent, right? So I was having to deal with a lot of international contexts. And what I kept encountering time and time again was DEI was really difficult to explain to a lot of international audiences. Like, it just did not feel very accessible to them. Some people are like, I don't know enough about the historical context to understand like what it really means and how it's relevant to me personally. And so one of the things that I had a lot of conversations about with folks was like, is there a way to have a conversation about this in a way that makes sense for everybody? Because like I said, I'm interested in having a conversation, and I'm interested in ways to communicate better, right? And so someone in the last session had asked a question about psychological safety. And so that's where I was brought, was to this thing of psychological safety, right? Because people mention it all the time. So psychological safety was something, the framework around it was developed by someone named Amy Edmondson. And Amy has done a lot of work on it. She actually has a profile on LinkedIn that you can also follow if you just want to see her continuing work. But the definition of psychological safety is the belief that you won't be rejected or humiliated in whatever setting or role, and you can describe what you're feeling pertaining to the workplace, all right? So that's one way to look at psychological safety. But what's really interesting about psychological safety is it talks about different types of diversity. And this is where I had my in with folks who didn't necessarily have an American historical context, or they were, basically like an engineering group in Brno, Czech Republic, where it was, very homogenous, like it's all white males. Or, even like our quality engineering team in Beijing in China, right? So a lot of people in the US are familiar with what's called the demographic diversity, right? So it's the stuff that, like for me, like I think top of my head, okay, so it's race, it's gender, it's sexual orientation, it's age. So that's what comes to mind for a lot of people is the demographic diversity. But it's really, really important to note there are 3 other types of diversity that are important to note that are relevant to everybody, no matter where you're at, or for most everybody. So expertise. Diversity of expertise is something that you experience everywhere. You will always have someone who is an expert, and then people are talking about the graying of open source. You will have people who are beginners. And there's a gap between the people who are experienced and the people who are beginners. And so when I was talking with a bunch of Czech engineers about this, I'm like, okay, who's been in like open source for like more than 10 years? And some of them raise their hands. And I'm like, who's been in open source like in the past couple of years? And you had people that raised their hands. And I just asked the question, I'm like, so do you think your experiences are identical? And everyone started laughing, right? Because like, no, it's not identical, because it's like if you're experienced, I assume that you know what you're doing. And as a beginner, I'm still trying to learn the ropes, right? And so it was kind of funny to actually ask that question because it seems so obvious. But I was like, okay, you know about diversity. The other thing is so many tech companies do remote work. Like when I was doing remote work, at Red Hat and even within the Linux Foundation, my team was geographically dispersed. So I had people in every time zone in North America, and I had people in the EU, and I also had people in East Asia. And sometimes I had to work with people in the ANZ region, which is Australia and New Zealand. And part of it is that you had to agree on when you were going to meet, right? But there were also just different ways of communicating. And also there was, sometimes people didn't understand, idiomatic expressions. And so that was sometimes would be an issue in terms of trying to communicate with folks. But a lot of people in tech can relate to having to work with people in different regions. So it's another type of diversity for people to know that may exist for them personally. And then the last one, even though open source technically has a flat reporting line, you still have managers. You still have individual contributors, right? And if someone is like titled a VP of engineering and you've got someone who's a junior engineer, like there's still gonna be a pretty wide disparity in terms of how they engage with process or engage with material. I mean, it's related, I think, to the diversity and expertise, right? But that was my way into having conversations about diversity, is to expand this blueprint of diversity that people were used to and to introduce this as, hey, people have actually done research on this, and these are the 4 main types that come up again and again. I have experienced all 4 repeatedly, but not everybody has, right, depending on where they're at. But a lot of people can relate to the other 3 diversities that are mentioned here. And I think that was super important for people to realize, okay, I am part of this story of diversity. This narrative actually applies to me. So I talked about the definition of psychological safety, but actually psychological safety is more meaningful because it pertains to the workplace when you put the word team in front of psychological safety. Team psychological safety is actually what we're talking about. We're talking about a team as a whole feeling like it's okay to take risks, to express ideas, concerns, to question, and to admit mistakes without fear of negative consequences. This is for the entire team, right? So psychological safety only happens if everyone on the team has this, okay? So one thing that was really interesting because people like to say, you know, if you've got a diverse team, it means you're gonna be more productive. And actually what was interesting to me is that that was not true. Like if a team is diverse, a lot of times they underperform. Why would they underperform? You know, and I said, that's a really important question because people use the argument, hey, if we have a diverse team, we're gonna be automatically be productive. And there are a lot of things at play here, right? So I don't know if anyone attended the last session, but there was a conversation about tokenism, about the fact that a vanity metric is like the number of contributors and then the number of a certain type of contributor, and how that's not meaningful in of itself because it doesn't measure if people are comfortable, if they're willing to stay, if they're willing to develop in that community. And that's what we're really concerned about. It's not that we have a diverse team, it's that there's a way for the team to communicate. All right, so the way to get to psychological safety, and this applies to every team, not just one type of team, but every team. And this is why I like the framework of psychological safety. And, you know, and I'm drilling down into it a little bit because people have different ideas of what it means. But I think it's very, very important to remember the team aspect and also the necessity to have a pathway and framework of communication that feels effective, right? And I have actually implemented this on my own teams, because like I said, I've had to work with folks across region, different cultures, in traditional DEI spaces, and it's always really important to have basically a process associated with it. So the first one is framing, right? So what do your meetings look like? What are they used for? Is one person completely dominating the conversation and they're the ones that give the readout? Are people allowed to actually talk about things that are different from that person who's giving, hey, this is our official story as a team? And so one of the things that was very important to me when I do meetings, like my meetings can be like just 5 people, but I've had meetings with as many as 100 people remotely. And I'm very, very comfortable. It doesn't matter how many people are in the meeting. What I do is like, okay, here are the updates I have. And then if I'm able to share like an agenda beforehand, go ahead and write down if there are topics you want to talk about. You don't have to even assign your name to it. You can go ahead and make a list of it, right? And I always ask people, I'm like, okay, so what went well? All right, what are your pain points? And you just describe the pain point. You don't even get into like it's someone's fault. No, we talk about, okay, I can't get this done because I do not have XYZ, And then we drill into, what's XYZ? And why isn't that happening? And part of the reason why you want to ask those questions is related to understanding, hey, everyone's got a pain point, and can we come to consensus on how to remove those pain points, right? And so that goes into the second point, which is inquiry, about listening. So I used to do a lot of work with the Native and Indigenous community at Red Hat, and one of the things that I thought was really cool is they had this thing called the talking stick. And so if you're holding the stick, only that person holding a stick was allowed to talk. And I think there's a version of that you can introduce in your own meetings. So it's a little bit different with 5 versus 100 people. So like if I had 100 people on a call, I would say, hey, can I give my updates first? Go ahead and put your questions in the chat, but let me get through this because I may answer your question beforehand, and then we can have a conversation just to make sure that it's not this free-for-all, right? And ask open-ended questions. That's why I'm like, hey, what are your pain points? What do you think went well? And part of the reason why you ask that is that we're all driving towards the same goal at work, right? We're all looking to ensure success on a project. Everyone has that in agreement if they want to do good work, right? And one of the things that people always said about me, they're like, you work with the most difficult people and somehow they get stuff done. How do you do it? This was how I did it, was I came in with a sense of inquiry. And then I reminded, hey, you know what? We are working towards the same goal. Like we're working on the same thing. How do we enable success for each other so that we're successful as a team? And so when you ask those questions and it's driven towards the project goal, it actually really shifts things. It doesn't matter what the background of that person is. It doesn't matter what their political affiliation is. Like, that has to disappear because you have now established we have to get this done. And we have to get this done in a framework that's respectful of each other. Now, when people think about psychological safety, sometimes they think, oh, it just means you can say whatever you want. No. Okay, that's not what that means. Yes, you want to tell the truth, but again, it needs to be within the framework of, this is my pain point. This is what I'm dealing with. Help me find a solution to getting things done. So you want to be very, very oriented towards, I want to enable success for the team and for each other. And that's the only way we're going to get it done, right? I mean, it's like being on a lifeboat. Like if people are rowing in different directions, you don't go anywhere. You just go in circles. And I don't know, if I'm on a lifeboat, I kind of want to get to shore so that I'm on solid ground. And I think that's one of the things that you want to really reiterate. It's like we want to all row in the same direction. Okay, so I mentioned Lily Zhang earlier, and Lily has an idea of what should happen after DEI. And Lily, I think, had some very good critiques. But some of the things that Lily observed when talking to literally dozens of DEI practitioners, and Lily themselves, they are a consultant, so you can hire Lily actually to consult for your group. But the pitfalls were like the one-off bias training. So who's ever taken an unconscious bias training? Me too, And did anything happen after your unconscious bias training? Was there any follow-up? I mean, for me personally, it was one and done. And literally, it ended with a video of people holding hands and singing. And I was like, you cannot make this up. Is this real? It was real. So that was my unconscious bias training. So it was like one and done. I know all about unconscious bias training. Yay. And then the other is shame-based education, right? One thing I want to acknowledge about this space is it's painful. It hurts a lot, And I say this as someone with an intersectionality of identities, Another identity I have is that I'm, I present as heterosexual when I'm actually pansexual, right? And so some of the stuff that comes into play, with shaming other people, because people maybe will assume something about you that is not true. I mean, it creates pain. And I'm just gonna say it, life is really short. Are we really here to inflict pain? I ask people that, I'm like, are we here to inflict pain on each other? Is that what we want to do? I think the majority of people are not sociopathic. I mean, I'm sure there's that group of people like, yes, I'm here to like make sure I harm as many people as possible. Okay, that could exist, but honestly, mostly in our day-to-day existence, people are not interested in experiencing pain or causing pain. And shame-based education was very damaging because it turned off a lot of potential allies. People didn't feel like they could be honest in their conversations. And so Lily's like, we have to frame the conversation differently, because if people are feeling shame, they're not gonna speak up, and we have to have a conversation about things that are painful, all right? I talked a little bit earlier about the superficial campaigns, like the social, I don't know if you remember, there were social posts everywhere about, we are committed to DEI, and we've got this group, and they had this really wonderful potluck with all the different foods from this particular culture. You know, you saw a lot of that going on a few years ago. Like, I don't know if you remember that, but it was like every company had that, you know, or they had the pride flag on a social media post or whatever. But it was not meaningful other than a post, right? And then another thing was that there was a focus on individuals, not systems. And this is, I will say to this, that this is probably the most challenging part of kind of our society and the context, is that there's not a lot that we can do with systems because we have people in the government who are defunding programs, right? And so there is gonna be basically a tracking back on individuals. But the thing is that we want to focus on systems. We want to focus on ways to frame things so that it's not just one person singled out, whoever that is, right? And of course, we have to have accountability. We have to have outcome tracking. We have to have metrics. So I don't know if there's anyone from the Chaos Project in here, but they do some really great metrics work. Justin, I'm gonna call you out. He is a community architect for Fedora. They have really cool ways of tracking things. And so I would encourage you to have a conversation with some of the communities that are actually doing it, and they're here, so. All right, so this is the framework that Lily envisions. It's called FAIR, and I know that sounds a little cheesy, but I actually really like it. Has anyone heard of the FAIR framework in here? Is this something that anyone's heard of? All right, so FAIR, fairness, access, inclusion, representation. And this is focused on systems. And it's focused on the well-being of everyone. You know, and I actually really, you know, like some people are like, well, you know, I've suffered so immensely. And the one thing that was always a pitfall when I was working with diverse groups, like especially if I was trying to do coalition building, and I was trying to depend on intersectionality to kind of get people together, is that I could not have it become a pissing contest about who suffered the most. You know, I mean, like, you can go on forever and ever about how much pain you've experienced. Like, my pain is so much worse than yours. Okay, you know, like I don't know if anyone ever watched Deadpool, but there's that conversation between Deadpool and the girl that he's wanting to date about like how bad their lives are. And it's comedic, right? Because you're like, this is ridiculous. But that happens a lot. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're like, hey, we want to recognize the fact that it's been challenging for a certain group of people to be able to you know, progress like into promotions or whatever. And then you'll have the person who'll say, well, life has been really hard for me too, you know, and you don't go there. Because all it does is everyone spins their wheels, everyone's like basically marinating in their pain, and there's no healing, there's no moving forward from that, right? So I like this framework because I actually care about the well-being of others, even people who are jerks. Only because that's a reflection of me and not on them, you know? And that's the thing that I remember is like, it's more about me and maintaining my integrity and my value system than about someone who's not in agreement with it. Like, I'm always gonna adhere to mine. So the 4 pillars of fairness, so that relates to policies and protections that prevent bias. Access, remove barriers to full participation for all. And like I said earlier, the one thing that people talked about when they were talking about fairness It's like, I want to just make sure I have the same access to resources as other people, And so we have to be careful of the appearance of exclusivity that, hey, only, this group's going to benefit, even if it's really well-intentioned, right? And part of it, like I said, is making sure that you have, policies and protections, and then you also have this access to resources. Like, people always want to know, hey, I'm going to be resourced adequately. And of course, inclusion is a psychological safety. So the psychological safety stuff that I reviewed earlier only works when you have the framework, only works when you have a pathway to have a conversation, if it involves intense listening, and also a way to share concerns in an open-ended way. It can't be a yes-no kind of conversation. I'm gonna say it takes practice, all right? It's not like you're gonna take this and then all of a sudden your group's gonna be instantly transformed by it. No, it's gonna be iterative, all right? And it may not be linear, it may not be like a great thing when you go through this, but if you go there with the idea like, okay, let's remind ourselves of what the definition is. This is what we're trying to accomplish. Then you can make sure that psychological safety actually happens. And of course, representation, we want people to be able to participate. We want people for underrepresented groups, but we also have to make room for allies. We need to make sure that we have room also for people to change. And this is the controversial part, right? Is that people may have a limited capacity for change. They may never be the person who's going to say, I'm going to speak up for you. But we do need to have room for folks to have movement. And movement happens at different speeds, because I think that's the thing that being engaged in this work, it's like, well, we're not moving fast enough on this, Like I said, I've been engaged in this work for 30 years. And you know what? Things actually have changed a lot since 30 years ago. I don't know how old anyone is, I'm not gonna ask. But I think back to when I was 18 and marching in the streets and saying, no justice, no peace. And we're marching and doing that now. But I do think about the fact it is different. The people I see showing up are different. The way that people frame conversations is different. My son is Gen Z. It's nothing for him to ask, yeah, so are you non-binary? What are your terms? Is your sister trans? I want to make sure that I'm respectful. I would have never imagined a conversation like that happening in a million years. And it's completely normal for him. So I just want to tell you, things do shift. It may take decades, but they do shift. So I don't want people to be hopeless, okay? This space is always up and down. It is never linear. It is the labyrinth where you do this number and you come close to the space that you recognize, but you're not in that same space. You've moved forward. And I want people to remember that. So here are some guidelines. You can take a picture of this. This is all in the what comes after DEI. This is basically all the stuff that I was talking about around FAIR. We're looking for win-win for everybody, right? A rising tide raises all ships, I think about the American Disabilities Act, right? Which, said, hey, you need wider doorways, you need to have bathroom stalls that are large enough for a wheelchair to come in. That didn't just benefit folks who are in wheelchairs. It benefited a lot of different people. It benefited the elderly with curbs that they can actually walk on without tripping. It enabled young mothers who had strollers and children running around that it could put them in a handicap stall and corral them better. And so even though it was designated for a group of people with physical disabilities, many people benefited. So that's the one thing that we always want to remind people is that when we have an effort in one section, that it's going to benefit everybody. And that's the example that I use a lot because most people can relate to that. So I think this is just an iteration of what I've already been talking about, and I know that we're running out of time. But yeah, I think that's really important to realize that this framework of FAIR is something that's really important because that's how we fight tokenism. That's how we ensure psychological safety, all right? So DEI actually isn't dead, it's evolving. And let's work together on making things fair, accessible, inclusive, and representative. and keep in touch with me. Like, come and find me. I'm just wandering around. So she said, you can wave me down, or you can get my contact info. I'm like, I think on every social media thing. But you can find me. I'm willing to have a conversation with you. And I love conversation. So yeah, so I hope that I get to meet some of you individually. So with that, because we're running out of time, or we've run out of time, we're at 5 minutes, right? Is it 5? Are there any questions or any observations that people want to share? Justin? Someone's going to run a mic to you just really quickly.
I guess the question is just, what would be your kind of personal advice about navigating the vulnerability in this, especially now? And I mean, kind of you touched on the whole context.
Yeah, that's a great question, all right? So, I mean, I think the biggest thing that has come up is the fact that there are safe spaces being taken away in the workplace. You know, like, I don't have, like, okay, this group that we had, okay, we're not having it anymore because, you know, we're not doing DEI anymore. Or we don't have this program anymore, right? So that you see these things that were in the workplace, these safe spaces taken away. And honestly, during a time like this is a rough time. I'm not gonna diminish it. This is a rough time. This is a really vulnerable, scary time. Like, I feel vulnerable, I feel scared. But I think what's really, really important is to know that there are people who are going to continue to care about this. And so when things started breaking down, I reached out to people within my community and, like, you know, we are going to designate check-ins, like one-on-one and in groups, so we can just talk about it. We can just talk about how scared we are. We can talk about the fact that I've had a hard week, and oh my God, those headlines, I'm like crying every night because of it. You know, because I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a reality for people. But the more important part is making sure your community is maintained. You have to make sure you're not alone. And I think, you know, I've had so many conversations with people about this, because people, I mean, people are like, is there anything we can do? Maybe not systemically right now because it's not resourced in a way that it needs to be. But we can still resource each other. We can still resource people within our community. We have control over that. We may not be able to affect an entire company or entire policy, but we can affect people within our communities. And that's how things continue, is that you have to be in remembrance and you have to be in acknowledgement, you know, that these things still matter, and that, hey, we're all scared together, we're all vulnerable together, but we're going to get through this together. And I think that's the message I always try to share with people when they approach me about stuff like that. Because yeah, it's hard. I don't think I do any service by saying it's not hard. It is hard. But look out for each other. You know, we need to start looking out for each other. And I am very intentional. I calendar it. I calendar the times I'm going to meet with people, because I want them to know it's important enough for me to schedule time with you. So I would encourage people to do that in their own communities, in their own circle. All right, so we only have like a couple minutes left. I'm around. I think they have the text tracks right after this. If you want to have just a casual conversation after this ends, I'm glad to do that. But is there a maybe quick question that I can answer? I don't know if there's a quick question.
It is not a question, so you don't need to answer, but I want to give an example of why not to lose hope. So I went to this talk as a non-American person, so I don't live in the US, and I feel, we are also looking from the outside, and we get that it's hard for you, but I mean, there are other companies, there are other areas, and there is hope, there is progress in other areas. You see it all around the world where there is progress in that sense still, and even so you're at a setback, others are still progressing, and we're hoping to influence back positively in the other direction as well. So the rest of the world is not gone, and there is progress, and let's keep hoping that we can learn from each other, and there's a positive backstep to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good reminder that people are still working on this in other areas. So I think we're done. For now, at least this talk is done. The conversation is never done. But I look forward to hopefully having a conversation with somebody, like I said, one-on-one. And yeah, like if you have things that you want to bounce off of me, I'm super happy to have a conversation with you. So thank you for coming to the last talk of the day, and have fun at the Tux Trek. So.